The signal came at 3:14 in the morning, and I was eating cold jollof rice when the world changed. Not the world technically, the galaxy, but sitting in a relay station outside Logos with rice going stiff in its container and 3 monitors blinking the same incomprehensible data at me from 3 different angles. The distinction felt academic. My name is Dara Akafor, Sergeant First Class, Nigerian Armed Forces, seconded to the UN Deep Space Monitoring Division, which sounds impressive until you understand that my entire posting consisted of myself, one junior analyst named Cole Briggs, who was 22 and still had opinions about things, and a coffee machine that had not worked since February. It was October. I had stopped filing maintenance requests in April. Cole was the one who flagged it. He had been running a routine sweep of the deep band frequencies, the ones we monitored mostly out of institutional habit, the ones that had produced nothing interesting in 11 years of continuous operation. He came to my desk with his tablet held out in front of him like it might bite him, his face doing something complicated that I had no word for. "Sarge," he said, "you need to look at this." I looked. The signal was clean. That was the first thing. Deep space signals are not clean. They are dirty and scattered and full of interference, and they arrive in fragments that take weeks of processing to assemble into anything coherent. This one arrived in a single packet, compressed, structured, and encoded in a format that our systems passed on the first attempt. Because, as we would later understand, whoever sent it had already studied our systems long enough to know exactly how to be heard. It was not long. 12 seconds of transmission. Our translator software, which was designed for atmospheric anomalies and was honestly never intended for this, took 4 hours to produce a working draft. Cole and I sat in that room for those 4 hours without speaking much. He made tea. I finished the rice. At some point the sun came up outside and neither of us commented on it. The translation printed, "We are the breath. We have lost our home. We have studied 63 species. We chose you. Please." Cole read it 3 times. Then he looked at me. "Please," he said, pointing at the last word like I might have missed it. I had not missed it. Please. I had been in the military for 14 years. I had done 2 tours in conflict zones, and 1 posting in a place so politically complicated I still could not talk about it at dinner parties. I had processed distress signals before. The language of desperation has a texture to it, a particular frequency of need that you learn to recognize the way you learn to recognize weather changes in your joints. This was that underneath all the alien structure of it, underneath the impossibility of the thing itself, that word was exactly that. I picked up my desk phone and called my superior officer, Colonel Adis Nasu, at her home. It was 6:00 in the morning. She answered on the second ring because she was the kind of person who answered on the second ring regardless of the hour. And I told her what we had. And there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call had not dropped. "Read it to me again," she said. I did. Another silence. "Don't send anything yet," she said. "Don't tell anyone outside that room yet. I'm making calls." The calls she made produced more calls, which produced emergency video conferences, which produced men and women in various states of undress, sitting in front of laptop cameras in kitchens and living rooms, and what appeared to be at least 1 broom closet. All of them read the same 12 words with the same expression Cole had worn when he first brought the tablet to my desk. It took 8 hours from the moment of translation for someone with enough authority to authorize a response. 8 hours of verification, of running the signal through every analytical tool available, of linguists and mathematicians, and inexplicably 3 economists being brought into secure video calls to weigh in on something none of them were remotely qualified to assess. At 1,400 hours, I received authorization to respond. They gave me the approved text. It was 14 sentences long, carefully worded, diplomatically hedged, and had been reviewed by 4 government legal teams. I smelled it. Then I sat back and looked at the ceiling of my relay station and thought about the word please. The breath responded in 40 minutes, which meant they were close, closer than anyone in those 8 hours of frantic conferencing had apparently thought to calculate. Because when the distance estimate came through from the trajectory analysis team an hour later, the secure chat channels erupted in a way that made the initial signal look like a minor administrative matter. They were already inside the outer solar system. They had been waiting. Cole brought me fresh tea, which was kind of him, and stood next to my desk, reading the trajectory data over my shoulder. "They were already here," he said. "When they sent the message, they were already here. Yes. They waited for us to say yes before they came closer. Yes." He thought about that. I could see him thinking about it. 22 years old, first real posting, and he was working out in real time what it meant that a species capable of crossing interstellar distances had stopped at the edge of our system and knocked before entering. "Who does that?" he said. I did not answer because I was already calculating fleet positions. It is what I do when I need to not feel something for a few minutes. I count things: ammunition, ships, personnel. It steadies me the way some people use breathing exercises, which I have always found unconvincing. The number of active carrier groups currently at sea was not enough. It was not close to enough for what was coming, though at that point I did not yet know the shape of what was coming. I only knew that 4 million beings had said please to us from across the stars, and that someone was going to have to figure out where to put them, and that someone was going to end up being people like me. The second breath message contained more. It contained a great deal more. It took 12 hours to fully translate, and when it came through, I read it in a single sitting in my chair, with cold tea going colder beside me, and Cole asleep on the break room couch, because he was 22, and had not yet developed my specific talent for not sleeping. The births were old. Their civilization had stood for 40,000 years. They had explored, catalogued, and made careful study of 63 spacefaring species across this arm of the galaxy. They had watched. They had never intervened. They had maintained their home system as a kind of deliberate removal from the rest of the galaxy's complicated politics, its wars, and its alliances, and its long grievances. And then something had ended that. The message did not say what. It used a word our translator rendered as the pursuing, and then moved on without elaborating. Cole woke up and came to read over my shoulder and pointed at that phrase. "The pursuit," he said, "that's doing a lot of work. It was doing a great deal of work. It was doing the work of an entire chapter of history that the breath had chosen deliberately not to include in their introduction. I noted it. I did not push on it. There would be time. What I kept returning to, what I could not put down the way you cannot put down something that has lodged itself behind your sternum, was the choice part. 63 species. They had studied 63 spacefaring civilizations, and they had chosen us. Humanity, a species that had been reaching space in any meaningful way for less than a century, was still arguing with itself about basic resource allocation that had produced both the Chinese Chapel and industrial environmental catastrophe within the same few centuries, and seemed genuinely surprised by the irony. A junior analyst from the translation team sent an internal memo at 2 in the morning asking why specifically. Nobody answered it. The memo sat in the shared inbox flagged unstressed while 12 governments began emergency sessions, and military commands across 4 continents started running logistic scenarios that none of them had wargamed for because no one had ever seriously modeled for this. I printed the memo out and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. Why us specifically? Below it, I pinned the translation. "We chose you, please." I looked at both of them for a long time. Then I went back to counting ships. The first breath vessel became visible to our deep-range optical arrays at 2200 hours. It appeared on screens across a dozen monitoring stations simultaneously, and for approximately 40 seconds, there was total silence across every secure channel as human beings in rooms on 6 continents stared at something moving against the stars that was not ours. It was not alone. Behind it, spaced with a precision that felt deliberate and careful rather than military, came more and more and more. Cole stood at the window of our station, which looked out over a patch of Logos night sky between 2 buildings. And even though there was nothing visible to the naked eye from where we stood, he stood there anyway and looked up. I understood the impulse. 4 million of them. That was the population figure in the third transmission. 4 million breath traveling in a fleet of ships that our analysts spent the next 72 hours cataloging, with expressions ranging from professional detachment to undisguised awe. The ships were old in the way that cathedrals are old, built with a kind of patient intention that does not hurry, that assumes the thing being made will outlast the people making it. They had packed everything they had left into those ships, everything they had left. Those 4 words hit me at 4 in the morning on the third day, when I had drunk enough bad coffee to stop tasting it and had been awake long enough that the edges of things had gone soft and strange. I read them in a translated inventory manifest and sat very still for a moment. Everything they had left. 40,000 years of civilization compressed into ships, carried across space to the doorstep of a species they had watched from a distance and made a calculation about. The calculation being these ones, these particular ones who are loud and contradictory, and have been spacefaring for less than a century, and still argue about things that species a tenth their age resolved millennia ago. These ones with their cold rice and their broken coffee machines and their junior analysts who ask questions nobody wants to answer. These ones will say yes. I thought about that for a long time. Then Colonel Nwasu called me and told me that my posting had been extended indefinitely, and that I was being attached to a new joint task force with a name that had not been decided yet, and a mandate that was being written in real time by a committee in Geneva. What does the task force do? I asked. Figures out what comes next, she said. I pinned that to the corkboard too. Not literally, but I held it the same way. Outside, Logos was waking up. Trucks in the street, a rooster from somewhere improbable. The specific smell of morning in a city that does not stop. Somewhere above all of it, 4 million beings were waiting to find out if the word they had risked everything on was going to mean what they needed it to mean. We chose you, please. I picked up my phone and started making calls. The United Nations General Assembly emergency session opened at 9 in the morning Geneva time on a Thursday, and was, by any honest accounting, a disaster that somehow produced the right answer. I was not in the chamber. I was in a sub-base briefing room 3 floors below it, surrounded by military liaison from 11 nations, and a smell of industrial carpet that I would later associate with the specific anxiety of watching history happen slightly too fast to keep up with. There were 6 screens on the wall. Each one was showing a different feed. One was the chamber floor. One was a real-time translation feed of the Breath Fleet's ongoing transmissions. One was a global news aggregate that someone had left running, which was a mistake because the global news aggregate in the first 72 hours of humanity's first confirmed alien contact looked approximately like you'd expect. Cole Briggs was next to me with a new tablet that actually synced with the others, which was the one logistical improvement of the entire week. "How long do you think this takes?" he asked. "Long." I said it took 17 hours. I will not recount all 17 hours because some experiences do not improve with full documentation. What I will say is that the arguments were what you would expect from a body of that size processing something that size on that timeline, which is to say they were human arguments, which is to say they were loud and contradictory and occasionally brilliant and occasionally so small-minded in the face of the thing being discussed that I had to look at the floor for a moment. 6 nations voted no within the first hour. Their reasons were different, but rhymed. Resources, precedent, the unknowable nature of whatever was pursuing the breath, the liability of committing to protection without understanding what protection would require. Someone actually used the word liability. Cole looked at me when that came through the feed. I looked at my tablet. 14 nations abstained initially. Several of those shifted over the following hours as the breath transmitted more. And what they transmitted was not a political argument or a strategic proposal. It was a cultural archive, music, visual records, the history of a species rendered in compressed data packets and aimed at a planet that had spent 3 days arguing about whether to open the door. The archive was not a negotiation tactic. The lead vet diplomat, whose name our translation team rendered as Vel, stated plainly in an accompanying message that the archive was being sent regardless of the vote's outcome. It was a gift given without condition, a 40,000-year civilization introducing itself to a 100-year-old one and saying, "Here is who we are, and you do not owe us anything for knowing it." I watched several of the abstaining nations' delegates reading the archive summary on their tablets in the chamber. Several of them shifted their votes. The Yes coalition was built in pieces over those 17 hours, patched together through bilateral conversations and last-minute amendments and the kind of procedural maneuvering that looks chaotic from the outside and is in fact a very specific kind of skilled work. By hour 15, the momentum had shifted enough that the remaining holdouts were negotiating over conditions rather than the fundamental question. The final vote passed with 17 amendments, a 12-month review clause, and language so carefully layered that parts of it could mean almost anything depending on who was reading it. Yes, that was what it meant underneath all of it. Yes. Cole exhaled when the result came through. He had been holding his breath for approximately the last 40 minutes, without appearing to notice. I did not exhale. I pulled up my logistics interface and started building a task list because the vote was the easy part, and what came after was not going to build itself. What came after was everything. My official title as of the following morning was Joint Refugee Integration Coordinator, UN Earth Defense Liaison Division. The title had been invented 48 hours before I received it, and still smelled like fresh bureaucracy. My office was a converted shipping container in Cape Town Harbor fitted with a window that I cut myself using a request form that nobody had approved, but nobody had denied either. Which in my experience is the closest thing to permission the military offers on short notice. I had 6 tablets. None of them synced with the others. I accepted this as a constant. Vel arrived 3 days after the vote aboard the first VHTH diplomatic vessel cleared for close approach. The ship was not large by breadth standards. Apparently, though, by human standards, it was large enough that the Cape Town Harbor team spent a full day reconfiguring the approach vectors before they were satisfied. I was on the dock when Vel came down the boarding ramp, 7 FT tall, bioluminescent, which means their skin carried shifting light in patterns that moved with their emotions. Though I did not know that yet, and spent the first 10 minutes trying not to stare in a way that was probably obvious. Their build was long and geometric, all clean angles, like whoever designed them had strong feelings about efficiency. They wore something that was not quite clothing and not quite armor, and moved in a way that made you understand at a level below that this was a being who had never needed to hurry because nothing had ever posed a serious threat to them until now. Vel stopped at the base of the ramp and looked at me with eyes that were large and amber and very still. "You are the one who answered the signal," Vel said. The translation came through my earpiece half a second after the sound, which created a slightly surreal effect of hearing 2 languages simultaneously. I was eating rice. I said there was a pause. We now said we watched. We chose you specifically. I processed the part where they had been watching before the signal. The part where specifically had a meaning I was not ready to unpack in a harbor at 7 in the morning. "Right," I said. "Let's talk about docking allocation." Vel's bioluminescence shifted into a pattern I did not have a name for. Later I would come to recognize it. I never did find a word for it. The closest I could get was something between fond and curious, and something else entirely. Some third thing that does not have a human equivalent. The first month was a lesson in how much you can accomplish when you stop waiting for complete information and just start solving the problems in front of you. The breath began arriving in organized waves. 4 million people is not a number that becomes real until you are coordinating the infrastructure for it, at which point it becomes extremely real with very specific sub-pros attached. Breath required particular atmospheric conditions in enclosed spaces which our engineers addressed with a combination of improvised filtration systems and a truly impressive amount of creative regulatory interpretation. They were partial photosynthesizers, which meant urban planning teams in Cape Town, Mumbai, and Buchen found themselves in urgent conversations about lighting infrastructure that none of them had expected to be having. They required 7 hours of specific sonic frequencies to achieve proper rest cycles, which our audio engineers worked out within the first 2 weeks, and which had the unintended side effect of making every human within range of the breathing sleeping quarters feel inexplicably calm. Vel assigned a junior diplomat named Sue to work with my team as a liaison. Sue was young by breath reckoning, which apparently meant several centuries old, and had a quality of focused attention that made every conversation feel like the only thing happening in the world. Sue was also, as I discovered early on, fascinated by human stress responses, specifically by the noise I made when stressed. It is not a dignified noise. It is not a noise I was aware I made. Sue brought it to my attention at the end of our third working day together, nodding that every time the logistic situation became particularly complicated, I produced a low verbalization followed by a specific phrase, and that this pattern had a measurably calming effect on the breath staff in the room. The phrase was, "Sweet, merciful logistics." "It is the rhythm," Sue explained with great seriousness. "The breath finds it deeply settling. We would appreciate it if you continued." I stared at Sue for a moment. Then I checked my supply manifests and let whatever noise came naturally come naturally. Sue brightened perceptibly, not metaphorically. The bioluminescence actually increased. The disasters were frequent and various, and not once catastrophic, which I came to understand was its own kind of achievement. A breadth family of 11 moved into a single-occupancy apartment in Johannesburg and reported it as comfortable. A curious birth adolescent named Kira disassembled a Brazilian naval frigate to its component parts over the course of an afternoon, apparently motivated by structural interest. She then reassembled it better. The frigate's captain, Lieutenant Commander Owen Graves, filed a formal complaint with my office, read back over it, and refiled it as a commendation. A district of Osaka reorganized its entire street lighting grid to match breath photosynthetic wavelengths. Unprompted, the residents coordinating through neighborhood message boards over the course of a weekend. The city council discovered this, after the fact, and after several days of internal debate, ratified it. Cole, who had been transferred to my team officially by this point, walked into my container office one afternoon with his tablet showing the Osaka story and stood there looking at it. "We're pretty good at this," he said. "Don't say that out loud," I said. "Something will break." "No, but genuinely, we're good at this. Why are we so good at this?" I did not answer him. I knew the answer or the beginning of it, but it was not the kind of thing I said out loud in the middle of a workday. It had to do with practice, with a species that had spent most of its history taking people in, not always gracefully, not always without conflict, but taking them in. It had to do with the specific competence that comes from having been the ones who needed shelter before. I thought about saying that. I filed it away instead. The intake numbers climbed steadily. The integration teams pulled from military, civilian, medical, engineering, and urban planning backgrounds across 40 nations worked at a pace that would have seemed impossible in a planning document, but felt somehow inevitable on the ground. Like we had always been building toward this capacity without knowing what we were building it for. Vel found me on the roof of my container at 2 AM in the morning, 40 days into the operation. I was eating rice cold again, because I am not a person who changes habits under pressure. The harbor was lit up below 3 new breath vessels, in the process of being guided to their berths by a dock crew that had developed its own improvised hand signal system for communicating with breath pilots. Vel stood at the edge of the roof and looked at the harbor for a while without speaking. Their bioluminescence was low and steady, the pattern I had come to associate with thought. "May I ask you something?" Vel said. "You can try," I said. "Why did you say yes?" Not a question quite. The inflection was different, more like something being set down carefully. I ate rice for a moment. "We've been the ones saying please before," I said. Vel's bioluminescence did the thing it sometimes did. The one my translator had no category for. The one I had stopped trying to name. They were quiet for a while. Below us, the dock crew's improvised hand signals were getting faster, more confident. Someone had a speaker balanced on a crate, and music was coming out of it. Something with bass that carried up to the roof and sat in the chest. "The key will come," Vel said. You should know that. I know. When they come, they will be difficult to explain. Most things worth dealing with are. Vel looked at me with those amber eyes that were very still and very old. You are not afraid, Vel said. I checked the supply manifest on my tablet. Ships in harbor, personnel counts, dry goods inventory for the incoming wave of 40,000 breath scheduled for arrival Thursday. I'm afraid of running out of sonic frequency generators, I said. Everything else is just a problem to solve. Vel made a sound that I would later understand was laughter. It was not a human sound, but the shape of it was familiar enough. Below us, the dock crew finished guiding the third vessel in, and someone on the ground let out a cheer that carried up to the roof without any help. The music kept going. The harbor lights shimmered on the water. I finished my rice. I started a new supply request form. 9 months and 11 days after the signal, I was in a budget meeting about portable sonic frequency generators when my tablet buzzed with a priority alert from the Deep Space Monitoring Network. I looked at it. I got up from the meeting without excusing myself, walked down the corridor of the Cape Town Coordination building, and stood at the window at the end of the hall. The sky outside was clear and blue and completely normal, the way skis are when something large is happening outside their frame. The alert was 7 words for the unidentified fleet edge of the solar system stationary. I stood there for a moment. The word stationary doing its own kind of work. They had stopped. Whatever was out there, it had come to the edge, and it had stopped. Waiting again. Again. Someone or something was waiting at the edge of our system to see what we would do. I went back to my container, sat down at my desk, and pulled up the communication logs from the monitoring network. The fleet had been detected 40 minutes ago. It had not moved. It was not transmitting. It was, as far as our instruments could determine, simply there, parked at the outer boundary, doing nothing but being present in a way that was extremely difficult to ignore. Cole appeared at my door with the expression of a man who has been running. You saw it, he said. Sit down, I said. He said, Is it them? He said, Is it the pursuing? I had briefed Cole on the breath transmissions regarding the pursuing 7 months ago when enough translation work had been done to give us a partial picture. It was not a complete picture. The breath had been careful about what they shared and in what order, which I respected, even while it complicated my planning work. What I knew was something had ended 40,000 years of breath civilization. Something with capacity, something that had at some point made the decision to chase probably, I said. He processed that. What do we do? I pulled up the current status of Earth's combined orbital defense network. The network was 8 months old. It had been assembled by an international coalition working at a pace that the individual governments involved had each privately thought was impossible, coordinated through a joint command structure that had produced 17 formal disputes and 1 actual diplomatic incident over jurisdiction and had somehow ended up functional, despite all of that, which I thought of as a very human outcome. I pulled up the fleet status next. Every nation with orbital or deep space capacity had committed ships to the Joint Defense Network when the breathing situation became clear. The fleet was not the largest in the known galaxy. I knew this because Vel had told me carefully and without drama that several species they had catalogued had fleet capacities that dwarfed what we had assembled. I had noted this, and then continued assembling what we had because you work with what you have. What we had was not nothing. What we had was a fleet that had been put together by 40 nations in 8 months because people on the ground in harbor towns had started building before anyone told them to. Because a dock foreman in Logos had seen the word please and started calling in favors because something in us, some deep, stubborn particular thing had decided before the committees finished deciding. I sent a message to Colonel Nwasu, then to the Joint Fleet Command. Then because the situation seemed to call for it, I sent a message to Vel. Vel's response came in 3 minutes. We know, the message said. We have been expecting them. We are sorry. I stared at that for a moment, then I replied, Don't be sorry. Tell me everything. What Vel told me took 4 hours to translate fully. I read the complete version sitting in my container at midnight with Sue present. Sue's bioluminescence steady and low, the harbor quiet outside. The KE, that was their name, transliterated through 2 languages. It came out flat and hard, 2 letters that hit the air like a door closing. The KT were a species roughly equivalent to the breadth in age and capacity, which meant very old and very capable with a history that ran alongside the breaths across thousands of years without direct conflict. They had not pursued the breath for conquest. They had not pursued them for resources or territory or any of the reasons that I, operating from a human frame of reference, had been quietly modeling for 9 months. They pursued them because of a prophecy. I am not a person who responds well to the word prophecy in a logistics context. It creates the kind of ambiguity that is difficult to put in a planning document. But the breath did not use the concept the way humans typically did, not as a prediction of fate, but as a compressed record, a kind of data structure that encoded patterns observed across thousands of years of interstellar study. The breath had a record 40,000 years old that described a species young, loud, contradictory, unable to agree with itself about anything significant, capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary generosity, sometimes within the same generation. A species that had something no other species in their catalog had. The specific habit of taking things in, of saying yes to the difficult thing. The record said that this species, when found, would be sheltering someone the breath had lost. The record said that when this happened, the galaxy would be different after Keith had read this record. They had been reading it for 20,000 years, watching for the species it described. When the breath began moving, when it became clear that their home was lost and they were going somewhere specific to someone specific, the sketch had followed. Not to destroy, not to conquer, to see if it was true. That was the pursuing 20,000 years of watching and a fleet sent to the edge of a small system around a medium star because they needed to know if the pattern was real. I sat with that for a long time. Then I pulled up the fleet status again and started calculating intercept windows. The Joint Command had been in emergency session since the fleet was detected. I joined the video conference at 0 hours and spent the next 4 hours in the specific kind of meeting where a great many people are being very smart and still arriving at conclusions more slowly than the situation warrants. The broad consensus was defensive posture, show capability without provocation, establish communication. The KET fleet had not moved and was not transmitting, which was either very good or very complicated, and there was substantial disagreement about which. At 0500, a message arrived from the Keith fleet. It was addressed to me, not to the UN, not to the Joint Fleet Command, not to Earth's head of state, which was a rotating position that month and was currently occupied by someone who had been very good at managing agricultural trade policy and had not signed up for this. To Sergeant First Class Dar Akifer by name, Cole read it over my shoulder and did not say anything. The message said, "You shelter the breath. You do not understand what you shelter." I looked at it for a long time. Then I picked up my tablet. I did not call the Joint Command first. I did not run it through the committee. I am aware that this was not procedurally correct, and I remain at peace with that decision. I typed my response. They said please. We said yes. That is the whole conversation. I send it. Then I put my tablet down and waited. The response from the K came in 40 minutes. 40 minutes during which the Joint Command discovered what I had sent and produced a volume of communication in my direction that I let route to a secondary inbox. The KE message was long. It took 2 hours to translate. When the full version came through, I read it in my container with Vel present, which I had requested because I had a feeling Vel needed to be in the room for it. The Keth had been watching us for longer than I had understood, not just since the breath signal, for decades. They had been watching humanity the way you watch something that might be what you have been looking for, with the careful attention of a species that has been wrong before about things like this and cannot afford to be wrong again. They had watched us take each other in imperfectly, expensively, in ways that caused friction and required constant renegotiation and keep doing it anyway. They had watched us build things in harbor towns before anyone authorized it. They had watched a dock foreman in Lago start calling in favors at 6 in the morning because he read the word please and could not do anything else. They had seen the Osaka lighting grid. They had watched Owen Graves refile his complaint as a commendation. They had been counting the things we built before we were told to. The message said, "We came to see if the record was true. We have seen it. We have our answer." And then at the end, one sentence which Vel read in the translation and went very still. The breath translator rendered it as, "We would like to discuss what comes next." I looked at Vel. Vel's bioluminescence was doing something I had not seen before. The patterns were different, deeper, something that in a human face would have lived around the eyes. "What does that mean?" I said. "The prophecy. What does it say we become?" Vel was quiet for a moment. Then Vel told me. I sat with it. I checked my sidearm, holstered, standard carry. I checked the ammunition count the way I always did when I needed not to feel something for a few minutes. It did not steady me. For the first time in 14 years of doing it, it did not steady me at all. The harbor was quiet outside. Somewhere on the dock below, the night crew was running cables for a new breath vessel berth. I could hear them talking to each other in the specific low register of people working at night. Comfortable in the work, comfortable in the company. Vel waited. "Right," I said eventually. "Let's talk to Keth." 3 years later, I was on the roof of my container at noon eating rice warm because some things changed. The container had a proper window now, one with a frame and a latch. Someone had painted the outside without asking me, a dark blue that matched the harbor water on clear days. I had not complained about the color. Cole was below managing the morning briefing for the new intake coordination team, which had grown to 43 people across 5 nationalities and 1 breath staff member who had decided entirely of her own initiative that ground coordination work was more interesting than diplomatic posting. Her name was Kira. Yes, the same Kira who had disassembled and improved Owen Graves's frigate. She had completed 2 engineering degrees in the 3 years since and was by measurable outcome the best logistics planner on my team. I had never told her that directly, because it would go to her head, and breathing with a swelled ego is a different order of management challenge than the human equivalent. Below the container, the harbor was running busy in the specific way it had been busy for 3 years now, which was a different busy from the emergency chaos of the early months. This was operational busy, routine busy, the kind of busy that means something is working. The dock crew on the eastern berth was a mix I had stopped noticing because I had stopped noticing it, which I took as a good sign. Nigerian, South Korean, Brazilian one breath who preferred physical work to office work and had a gift for cable configuration that Owen Graves's engineering team had been studying for a year. They were arguing about something and laughing about it simultaneously. The way you do when the argument is not really an argument. There was music from a speaker on a crate. There was always music. Now, Vel came up the roof access ladder at 12:30, which was not unusual. In 3 years, Vel had become a presence in my daily routine, the way certain fixtures become, not noticed until absent. The Keith ambassador made a formal complaint about the weather, Vel said. What about it? It is not consistent. It's the weather, I said. They come from a system with a very stable primary star. Vel said the variation here is distressing to them. I ate rice. What do they want us to do about it? Nothing. They wanted to lodge the complaint formally. Did they use the word liability? Vel's bioluminescence shifted into the pattern I now recognized as humor. They used a word we translated as administrative grievance. File it with Cole, I said. Vel sat down on the roof edge, which took a moment of geometric arrangement given the berth build. Below us, the dock crew had resolved whatever the argument was, and 2 of them were shaking hands. The breath crew member was doing the hand gesture that meant agreement in the sign language the dock team had developed over 3 years, which was now being documented by a linguist at the University of Cape Town, who called it the most efficient bilingual gestural system she had ever catalogued. The KE ambassador's complaint was not the only KE administrative grievance filed that week. The KE had taken to the bureaucratic process with a thoroughness that nobody had anticipated. In the 18 months since the fleet had stood down and the first KET diplomatic vessel had entered Earth orbit, the KE mission had filed 347 formal complaints, requests, inquiries, and procedural challenges with the Joint Breathiman Coordination Office. They were meticulous. They were detailed. They followed up. Owen Graves, who had been seconded to the Joint Coordination Office as a naval liaison, had told me privately that he found the K more manageable than most of the human delegations he had dealt with in his career, because at least the K did what they said they were going to do. I thought that was fair. The Kayath were learning in the specific, painful way that a very old species learned something genuinely new, what it meant to be in a room with humans. They were not good at it yet. They found human social texture baffling. The way humor arrived without signal. The way disagreement could exist alongside warmth. The way we could argue about something and then go eat together as if the argument had not happened, which to the Keith read as either profound dishonesty or profound tolerance, and they had not yet determined which. Their junior diplomat of the translation team called Eric had taken to sitting in on my team's morning briefings without invitation. Nobody had told Eric to stop. Cole had started saving a chair. The breath were settled. That is not a small sentence. 4 million people settled. Not in the sense of silent or resolved or finished, because nothing is ever finished, but in the sense of having found the shape of a life that fits the place they are living. The integration had been expensive and chaotic, and had required more creative regulatory interpretation than I cared to formally document. It had also worked. The Osaka lighting grid has been adopted as a design standard in 17 cities. Kira had published 2 engineering papers, a breath concept, 4 syllables untranslatable in any single English phrase, had entered common use across multiple languages. The closest rendering was something like the dignity of being chosen by something that had many other choices. It was used by humans, increasingly not in alien context, but in ordinary human ones, between friends, between generations, in the language people used when they were trying to describe something they did not have a previous word for. Vel was quiet for a moment, watching the harbor. The Ketch asked us something last week. Vel said, "What did they ask?" "They asked why we chose humanity." I waited. "We told them," Vel said. I looked at the harbor. The dock crew below had started on the cable run for the new berth. The breath crew member directs with the ease of someone who has done something enough times that it has become its own form of fluency. "What did you tell them?" I said. Vel's bioluminescence shifted into the pattern I had no word for. The third thing, the one that was not fond and not curious, but something past both of those. "We told them that humans say please back," Vel said. I ate rice. Below, the music from the dock crew's speaker changed to something with a melody you could follow. The kind of song that finds you before you decide to listen. One of the dock crew started singing along, not performing. Just singing the way you do when you forget you're doing it. The harbor was full. 3 breath vessels in berth, 1 Ket diplomatic ship at the far dock, 2 human naval vessels running escort rotation, a supply tender, a research vessel, the debris of an operational thing, cables and crates and the particular organized disorder of a place that is working. 3 years ago, I had sat on this roof and told Vel that we had been the ones saying please before. I had meant it as an explanation, as the shortest true thing I could say about why a species responds to need with capacity instead of calculation. I still meant it, but I understood it differently now. The word please is not just about asking. It is about the relationship between the one who asks and the one who answers. It creates something, an obligation that is also a choice, a weight that is also a kind of trust. The breath had said please to us because they believed, based on 40,000 years of observation, that we were the species that would answer and not regret it. Kath had come to see if that was true. They were still here 3 years later, filing administrative complaints about weather and learning to sit in chairs and watching the dock crew working slowly in the careful way of something very old, learning something new, and beginning to understand what they were watching. What they were watching was the answer. Not a dramatic answer. Not an answer that would look good in a monument. An answer made of sonic frequency generators and improvised cable systems. And a dock foreman in Logos who started calling in favors at 6 o'clock in the morning. An answer made of warm rice instead of cold rice, which is a small thing. But small things are what most of life is made of. Vel stood to leave the geometric rearrangement of a tall body preparing to use a ladder. Eric asked Cole this morning why Cole saves them a chair. Vel said. Cole told them it was because everyone needs somewhere to sit. I thought about that. What did Eric say? They filed a formal request to continue attending the briefings. What did Cole do? He told them the chair was already theirs, Vel said. And then he asked if they wanted tea. Vel went down the ladder. Below the dock, crew finished the cable run, and the berth crew member gave the two-handed signal for completion. And the crew lead, a woman named Patricia O., who had been running harbor operations for 11 years and had adapted to the last 3 with a calm competence that I deeply admired, gave the signal back and made a note on her tablet. The next breath intake wave was Thursday, 12,000 people. Housing was ready, the medical was ready. The sonic frequency arrays in the new district were calibrated and tested. Kira had signed off on the structural modifications to 3 residential blocks. Cole had the supply chain mapped to the day. We were ready. Not because we had been designed for it, not because anyone had planned. In any of the decades leading up to that signal at 3:14 in the morning that this was what we would be doing, but because the capacity had been there built in pieces over a very long and very complicated history of taking things in. Built from need and failure and the specific human knowledge that you do not wait for perfect conditions to begin. You begin. I looked at the harbor one more time. Then I went downstairs to help with Thursday's prep. The rice could wait.